Welcome to my craft area. I'm Anna Hellman and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Let's look at today's project. The Sand and Sea product suite is one of our absolutely gorgeous sets in our new mini catalog. And here the last few days I've been playing around with this, and if you can't tell here, I've really been enjoying it. And I started coming up with these different ways to combine the products in this suite to get some really amazing effects on my cards. So I wanted to share this with you today, and you can see my samples here. When we get to the end of the video, I'm going to go through each one of these and explain exactly how I did each one. The way I want to start is to walk you through how to use the stamps and the dies and the embossing folder in this suite, because it's really a unique set that coordinates really wonderfully. So I want to show you first how you can use these products together. Then we will go through and I will explain exactly how I created each one of these cards. So the first thing I want to do is show you how I created a template for how to line up the stamps and stamp them so that then when I die cut, they have been stamped in the proper place. So what I did, I took a 5.5 by 8.5 piece of, I apologize for the glare here, 5.5 by 8.5, and that doesn't really help, does it? Piece of, yep, nope, it's not working, is it? Okay, we'll just go with it. 5.5 by 8.5 piece of cardstock here. Now, I was going to use a smaller piece. I decided to go with this larger piece for a reason. Doesn't need to be quite as long here, but I would recommend 5.5 inches wide. And I die cut it first. Let's look at the dies. And actually I'll bring in the stamp set as well. So here's the stamp set and the dies. And in the stamp set, we get these beautiful shells, sand dollar, some seaweed or kelp, some nice texture stamps, which you can also use to fill in the shells if you like. And then it has really neat greetings. Happy birthday to my beautiful friend. You are unique and completely amazing. Friends are like seashells. You collect them along the way. This is adorable. Love you to the beach and back. And then a few more general ones as well. Then we have the die set, and this is one large die that will cut out all of the shells and as a part of this one large piece, which is gorgeous. Then we have a few smaller ones, the sand dollar, one of the small shells, the starfish, and the seaweed pieces. So this is what comes in the set. Then there is also a coordinating embossing folder that aligns perfectly, love this, with this big and amazing die. So that's what comes in the set. Now the product suite also includes some designer paper, which is beautiful. I used it on some of the cards for today, and some really pretty opal embellishments. There are a few other things that come in the set. You can order the whole thing together if you're interested in that. So let's get back to how to use this. I first took that big die, I cut it out of a piece of 5.5 by 8.5 paper, and I left it all attached. I actually used some Scotch tape here to hold it all together. And what I'm using this for is my template for lining up my stamps so that I can stamp this all together on a piece of cardstock and then cut out the whole thing with my stamps already in the proper places. So I took this, I took my seashell stamps, and I lined each one up in the proper place. So there's that stamp. Now I've already done these other ones, but when I did this, I lined up this shell in the proper spot, this shell in the proper spot, this shell in the proper spot. When you're ready, you bring over your plate, you press to attach, and hopefully they are all in the right spot. Now, one of mine had been in the wrong spot, so I just removed that one and realigned it. And this time, we'll see if they're all in the right place. So now we can get rid of the template, and we want to bring in our cardstock to stamp on. So I'm going to stamp on some crumb cake cardstock with some crumb cake ink. So ink this up. What's nice about this is you can just use this for one card if you want, once you have everything set up, or you can stamp quite a few and either turn them into cards right then, or you could store them and have them on hand to make projects with later. Okay, so we have this stamped. Now we are going to die cut it out. So I want to line this up. Here I have my plates for my cut and emboss machine. We'll lay this right on here. We need to align the die. And if you like to use tape to hold everything in place, you can, but I usually find that I don't need to. Put my other plate on top. So let's bring in the machine. We will crank this through and cut it out. So there you can see we have this piece with the seashells all in the proper spots, and it's all cut out. Now, you may be thinking, well, I want to use the shells on their own. I don't really want to use the shells all in this big piece, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But now that we have that cut, I want to use the embossing folder to emboss it. So I'll open up my embossing folder and align the piece so that the shells and the seaweed all line up. And shut it, make sure it looks like it's in the right spot. And that does. Looks like everything's in the right place. So for this 3D embossing folder, I need my plate 1 and I need plate 4 on top of the folder. So we'll crank this through. And check out the results. So now we have this piece with the stamped shells and that amazing texture. And when they're stamped, it's actually a little bit harder to see that texture, but when I show you my card samples up close, you'll be able to appreciate the texture that it gives when you have not stamped the shells. Now, I'm going to show you these different techniques I use for these cards. Like I said, now I want to use a blending brush to add some color to this. So all I did to do this was just ink up, and actually I'm going to use a darker color. I'm going to use some early espresso because this will be easier to see that the color applied. So then I just started using my blending brushes, and you'll see in my samples, some of them I did something like what I'm doing right now with adding a brown of some sort to the entire piece. Now on some of them, then I actually added more color, and you'll get to see that. Okay, so that's the blending brushes. This is just for a sample, so I am not going to finish that all the way. Next, and this is possibly my favorite, on one of my projects, I added some shimmer paint, which adds just a gorgeous effect to the project. So here is some of our Champagne Mist shimmer paint. Shake it up, and I have a sponge here. So what I did, I tipped it over to get some of that paint on on the sponge and I dabbed off some of the extra and just started swirling this around gently over my die cut to add that beautiful shimmer paint. And this, I was just amazed after I got done with this. It's been a little while since I've used this shimmer paint on one of my projects. And now that I've done it here, I'm remembering how much I love it and thinking, wow, I need to put shimmer paint on all my projects. So you'll probably be seeing it more here soon on some other things. So here, I'll move this around so you can appreciate how beautiful that is. So that adds a really neat effect. I did this with one of my cards. And then if you want to, like I said, you may be thinking, well, what if I don't want to use all of these as one big piece? What you can do is just take some snips and remove these from that big piece. And then you can use your individual shells that way. So you'll see one of my card projects that I did that on. Okay, so you get the idea. I can cut the rest of that off. But those are most of the techniques I used on these cards. Now let's take a look at the card samples and I'll explain them. So let's start with 3 cards that I've shared in project videos before. This card, I used the pearlescent paper, which is so, so pretty. And I simply use that embossing folder and use that piece over top. This is one of the pieces of the Sand and Sea designer paper. And just that simply, I created a card that beautiful. Now this one, I did the exact same thing, except I used my blending brushes and I applied a little bit of color to the shells and the seaweed. And I absolutely love how that turned out. This one, we will link you to the video for this one. On this one, I used that embossing folder. And then I applied, actually I did this first. I applied glue over the whole piece, let it dry, applied it with a sponge, let it dry. And then I applied the gilded leafing and embossed it after that. So I can link you to that video so you can learn a little bit more about that. Now let's look at the new cards that I have not shared before, and I'll explain each one. So this one, I used our pearlescent paper. I die cut it out and then I embossed it. And in the background, if you can see that piece that looks a little bit like sand, that's another piece of that Sand and Sea paper. But I just absolutely love this. It is one of the prettiest things I think I've ever created just with a die cut and an embossing folder. So that's a sample. Next, I cut the die cut on this one out of crumb cake paper, crumb cake cardstock, and then I sponged over it with some early espresso ink. I didn't do any stamping on this one, and I love how that early espresso really brought out the texture from the embossing folder. The background on that one again is that Sand and Sea paper. Here, this is some of our velveteen paper from our annual catalog. I haven't used this a lot in projects that I've been sharing, but I thought it would be fun to try it on this. After I die cut the piece from that velveteen paper, I use the embossing folder, and I also use blending brushes to add just a touch of color. Now in the background, I embossed my Misty Moonlight card base with the Old World embossing folder, and I thought that looked really nice. Looks a little bit like waves back in the background. Okay, this next one, I die cut the piece out. I use the embossing folder and I use my blending brushes to apply color. And I thought this just turned out beautifully. The background is some of our Oso Ombre paper from Celebration that you can get free through the end of February. This one, if you like rich cards, this right here could be up your alley. So sometimes I get go a little overboard with my fancy rich cards, and this is one of them, but I love how it turned out. So I started with crumb cake cardstock. I stamped the shells, I die cut it out, I embossed it like I showed you here a minute ago. Then I added that shimmer paint. This is the one I added the shimmer paint on. Then I decided to take it a step farther and I used some brass foil paper in the background with our It's the embossing folder in our art gallery product suite. I am forgetting the name right now, but I used that in the background. And that is just like about as fancy as cards can get, I think. This one here, you can see a sample where I did cut those shells apart. So when I stamped with the Versamark. I used gold embossing powder and heated that up to melt it and heat set it. Then I snipped them apart, got those shells, and used some of that sand and sea paper in the background. I tore a couple of pieces of crumb cake for the sand and used my blending brush to add just a little hint of color to it. Then I added these shells and the little opal embellishments. And last but not least, here is one that I use my blends markers on. So I cut this out, I embossed it, and then I used my blends markers. And I don't know if you can tell, I actually used the deboss side. So I actually used the opposite side from what I used on the rest of these. So I just used my blends markers, added color based on where the embossing and debossing lines were. So where it was lower down, I added some of the dark colors, and this is the way it turned out. So I think that turned out really pretty. What's interesting is the effect is really not too different from the one I use my blending brushes on. So if I were to pick one for next time, I would say I would do this one again with the blending brushes, just because it was much faster and much easier. But I do also love the way the one with the blends looks. So those are my samples for the Sand and Sea product suite. I hope you really enjoyed this. I hope this gives you a lot of inspiration for how to use these products. Thanks so much for joining in today. For more information and links to the products used today, click in the video description box down below to visit my website. Make sure you also click down below to subscribe to my channel and hit the little bell to receive notifications when I share new videos. I truly appreciate you being here, as well as every like, share, and comment that I receive. I'll see you again next time when I'll be back helping you to hand make with love.